Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Reading Culture. We will continue in this video looking at A Man for All Seasons, the play by Robert Bolt about Sir Thomas More. When we left off in the last video, Thomas More had just been made Chancellor upon the fall of Cardinal Wolsey, and got a commentary by the common man, the character who breaks the fourth wall that is meant to represent the common mass of humanity and addresses the audience directly. This sets up, in many ways, the end of the play, as it is this position, this public position of Chancellor, and More's inability to serve the state as it wants to be served, that will bring about the tragic end, if we want to call it that, of the play. So as we step back into the text here, it's important to note the sense of, again, the character, and particularly this struggle and this pull between his various forms of duty. So, for instance, we have a conversation between Thomas Cromwell and Chapuis, who is the Spanish ambassador. Cromwell is insisting that the king is once again going to force More to talk about the divorce, which the king so desperately wants, and More is unable to consent to, as it goes against the laws of the church and the realm. Cromwell says, "Oh no, they'll talk about the divorce." Chapuis cannot believe that this is coming up yet again, and says, "Well, he's given his answer." Cromwell insists that he will ask him, as the king will ask him for another. Chapuis's response is that Thomas is a good son of the church. But Cromwell's response is that Sir Thomas is a man. The implication being ultimately, of course, that, like any man, he will give in to the pressure of this authority. Now we see the steward, Matthew, played by the common man, who plays multiple characters throughout. We see him giving information to Cromwell, to Chapuis, it seems, to anyone who asks for it. And Chapuis notes that no man can serve two masters, quoting from the Bible. But we see that the steward seems to be able to either serve all the masters or perhaps serve just one himself. He indeed explicitly says that he would have told Chapuis anything he wanted to know about his master, Sir Thomas More, although all Chapuis really wanted to know was his religious habits, how often he prayed. And the steward says, "I would have told him any number of things about Sir Thomas, that he has rheumatism, prefers red wine to white, is easily seasick, fond of kippers, and afraid of drowning." You'll remember from the last video the imagery of water throughout this play, and keep that in mind, fear of drowning. So after this moment in the play, we get the arrival of the king. He's coming to see More, who, as his friends and servants search for him, is just coming out of prayer and dressed like a cleric, which the Duke of Norfolk finds utterly ridiculous. "A parish clerk, my Lord Chancellor, you dishonor the king and his office." More thinks differently and says the service of God is not a dishonor to any office. This will again be the crux of the play in many ways. These two spheres of duty and responsibility which More has, and their incompatibility at this moment in the state of England. So we get the arrival of the king. We get a very amusing scene where we see that More's daughter, Margaret, is actually better at Latin and more intellectual than the king. But we finally get this moment between More and King Henry VIII. Right? The king is saying, "No courtship, no ceremony, Thomas." Right? In other words, speak to me like a friend. And More makes it clear that he cannot consent to this divorce. But at one point, in response to the king's anger at this, he draws up his sleeve and says, "There is my right arm. Take your dagger and saw it from my shoulder, and I will laugh and be thankful, if by that means I can come with your grace with a clear conscience." And Henry understands that he would serve him, even though his conscience means that he cannot agree. But the king is adamant that his position is clearly right, which results in More asking quite sensibly, "Then why does your grace need my poor support?" And here we get the point of why Henry is so determined throughout this play that More must support him publicly. He says, because you are honest. What's more to the purpose, you're known to be honest. There are those like Norfolk who follow me because I wear the crown. And there are those like Master Cromwell who follow me because they are jackals and with sharp teeth, and I am their lion. And there is a mass that follows me because it follows anything that moves. And there is you. Moore is not one of these. The support of Moore speaks 100 volumes more than any of these other people because he is known to be a man of conscience who follows what he believes to be true. However, he cannot consent to the king's divorce, and the king leaves greatly angered, which not only angers but also vexes and disturbs his family, that he would cross as king. His wife Alice says, be ruled as by the king, and if you won't rule him, be ruled. In other words, either rule the king or be ruled by him, but don't oppose him. To which Moore says, I neither could nor would rule my king, but there's a little area where I must rule myself. It's very little, less to him than a tennis court. Again, keep this in mind. You remember from the preface, the playwright Bolt indicates that there's this sense of this little bit of land that is called the self that cannot be surrendered. And you'll see this imagery of this little bit of shrinking land throughout. All right, so we get the reintroduction of the character Roper, who again is very much a kind of foil for Moore. Whereas Moore is always steadfast in his opinions throughout the play, Roper's are constantly changing. So we meet Roper again. He's gone from a heretic to a faithful son of the church to now a even more faithful one. And so he notes that my views on the church, I must confess, since last we met, my views have somewhat modified. I modify nothing concerning the body of the church. The money changers in the temple must be scourged from thence with a scourge of fire if that is needed. But an attack on the church herself? No, I see behind that an attack on God. And he starts going off about the devil's work and the devil's ministers. So he's as opinionated as ever, but his opinions have once again changed. But Moore will not hear it. He says, for heaven's sake, remember my office. Right? Roper accuses him of standing on his office. He says, I don't stand on it, but there are certain things I may not hear. In other words, as chancellor, he would, for honesty's sake, for conscience' sake, have to repeat, especially under oath, what Roper tells him, and so he will not hear it. This is, again, an important part of his character, especially in relation to the law. We're also going to then see this with regards to Richard Rich. Richard Rich re-enters. We know that Richard has been giving information to Cromwell, right? The last time we saw him, we got a sense of his character. And he's once again imploring Moore to employ him. Moore refuses. Why? Because he knows that he cannot answer for himself. He's not honest. And so his friends, right, Richard Roper and the rest, are saying that he ought to have him arrested. And as Lord Chancellor of England, he very well could have him arrested. Indeed, probably without even sufficient evidence. But he will neither employ him nor arrest him. And he indeed says explicitly, and go he should if he was the devil himself until he broke the law. Right? This is anathema to Richard Roper, who says, so now you'd give the devil benefit of law. This is exactly true. Moore says, yes, what would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil. And here we see a great exemplification of what Roper's character is like. I'd cut down every law in England to do that. Moore responds to this by saying, oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned around on you, where would you hide, Roper, the laws all being flat? This country's planted thick with laws from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's, and if you cut them down and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I'd give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake. So he uses this image of the laws as trees covering the land of England, and that to cut them down, even to get after the devil himself, only bring upon you a wind that you would not be able to stand upright in. And it is this insistence on the sanctity of the law that is going to, in many ways, set Moore apart from nearly every other character in the play, the fact that he is a lawyer. You get another image of, if not the law, at least principles, and another nautical image. Moore says, and he's speaking to Will Roper here. Will, I trust you with my life, but not your principles. You see, we speak of being anchored to our principles, but if the weather turns nasty, you up with an anchor and let it down where there's less wind, and the fishing's better. And look, we say, look, I'm anchored to my principles. So again, keep that image in mind with regards to the general symbolism of water that we're seeing throughout the play. It's a very important image. Meanwhile, the man who had recently been in question, Richard Rich, is once again meeting with Cromwell, who indeed uses the very language of the king, no ceremony, no courtship. He's trying to get Richard to inform for him. And Richard wants to know, what do I have to do for these rewards? Right? He's going to make him collector of revenues. Cromwell says, nothing. It isn't like that, Rich. There are no rules with rewards and penalties. So much wickedness purchases so much worldly prospering. Are you sure you're not religious? Almost sure, says Richard. Cromwell orders him to get sure. You see, it's the exact opposite of the world of Moore, the world of the law. There are no rules in the world of Cromwell, of political pragmatism. So, Rich agrees to inform, and yet he doesn't seem very happy about it. And this is noted by Cromwell. It says it's a bad sign when people are depressed by their own good fortune. Rich tries to assure him that he's not depressed, but Cromwell assures him that he at least looks so. Rich says, I'm lamenting. I've lost my innocence. To which Cromwell notes, you lost that some time ago. If you've only just noticed, it can't have been very important to you. So we get the sense that Rich believes that his innocence is important to him, but he lost it without even noticing. Again, a good juxtaposition with some of the other characters, particularly the main one. We also get a sense of how easy this slippery slope of going against one's conscience, right, can actually affect the characters. So he informs, and Cromwell notes that that wasn't too painful, was it? Rich notes, laughing, that it wasn't. And Cromwell assures him, that's all there is, and you'll find it easier next time. And we'll see just how easy it becomes for Rich as the play goes on. But as the first act ends, we see Cromwell determined to frighten Moore. But Rich says this of Moore, he says, you wouldn't frighten him, you wouldn't find him easy to frighten. You've mistaken your man this time. He doesn't know how to be frightened. Cromwell disagrees. Doesn't know how to be frightened. Why, then he never put his hand in a candle, did he? And he shoves Rich's hand into the candle. Rich cries out, shouting that he enjoyed it. And perhaps Cromwell did. But we are going to see exactly what the character of Moore does when he does have his hand to the candle, at least metaphorically. As the second act begins, right, we see the reintroduction of Roper, who not only is no longer officially a heretic anymore, right? He's now gone the full way. In fact, even Moore accuses him of looking like a Spaniard, as he is saying how his dress is meant to express his allegiance to the church. So again, we see this changing character of Roper in contrast to Moore. We also get this interesting reference once the character of Chapuis comes in. He notes that another great scholar, Erasmus of Rotterdam, refers to Moore as the English Socrates. And Moore responds to this by saying that he has no taste for hemlock. So what is this reference to? If you watch the video on the allegory of the cave by Plato, you may recall that in that allegory, the person who goes up and out of the cave and finds the light and tries to lead people out of this cave of darkness and ignorance is ultimately put to death. And that this is a reference by Plato to his master Socrates, who for teaching philosophy was accused of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, and he was sentenced to death, and he willingly took hemlock, a poison, right, at his symposium and died. So More doesn't like the comparison to Socrates. He doesn't like this idea that he might have to be a martyr to the truth. But keep that image in mind. So More has decided that he will resign once the king's divorce goes through. Not only the king's divorce, but also the king proclaiming himself the head of the church in England. And this is seen as a signal, Chapuis believes, to all those who believe along the same lines. And he is trying to recruit More for resistance. More is willing to resist passively, but not actively. He admits in the next scene with Norfolk, that the king has declared war on the Pope. And yet he refuses to declare war on the king, despite his continued allegiance to the Pope and the Catholic Church. Indeed, he even tells the Duke of Norfolk exactly what Chapuis had told him, that he had been in the north and that there was much support there for the Catholic cause against the king. This seems to surprise Norfolk, who responds, this is on page 93, who responds that it's good to know you still have some vestige of patriotism. Moore remarked that's a remarkably stupid observation, Norfolk. In other words, Norfolk is surprised that he would be patriotic despite the fact that he is refusing to go along with the state. Moore sees that these two things are different, but not everyone else does. For example, his act of resigning is seen as a gesture. He's surprised by this. Now I understand you, Will. Morality is not practical. Morality is a gesture, a complicated gesture learned from books. Right? For Moore, morality is not a gesture, and to resign his position out of conscience is not a gesture. He does believe, however, that this act of resignation will save him. He says he must remain silent. It's only a lifeline, he says, this remaining silent. We shan't have to use it, but it's comforting to have. Oh, no. When they find I'm silent, they'll ask nothing better than to leave me silent. You'll see. So he's being silent about his reason for resignation, even to his own family, just in case they should be put under oath. Meanwhile, we see that the sides are lining up, and Moore is caught in the middle. We have a discussion between Cromwell and Norfolk. Cromwell saying, bear with me, your grace. Now, if he opposes Spain, he supports us. Well, surely that follows. Or do you see some third alternative? In other words, for Cromwell, there is no third alternative. Either he supports the state, or he supports the enemy of the state, of England, which is Spain. There is no third alternative. Not for them. And we see them plotting. They're trying to get evidence of bribery that Moore took this cup, even though Moore is famous for being one of the only people in his position who wasn't guilty of bribery, or of accepting bribes. And so we get Cromwell saying that that he's a slippery fish, and that they need a net with a finer mesh. So Cromwell claims that we'll weave one for him. Right? There's a sense that whatever they have to do, the truth doesn't come into it. They will enact the state's punishment, or at least compliance, upon Thomas More. You now get the other side of this coin in the scene with Chapuis and his attendant, where Chapuis is claiming that in the long run, of course, all good men everywhere are allies of Spain. No good man cannot be, and no man who is not can be good. And so he says that if he, that's More, is opposed to Cromwell, he's for us. There's no third alternative. Again, they cannot conceive of what More conceives of. And he tells Chapuis this to his face. He says that although apparently it seems that everyone thinks that they know his opinion, that what is less well known is his loyalty to the king. For More, there is a third alternative: loyalty to his king and opposition to the dictates of the state, by passive resistance. And indeed, he refuses even to accept money from the church, lest he be seen as being paid off. And even though his family is now beginning to live very poorly, and he sees this as a question of wit in many ways. This, again, he's accused of using lawyers' tricks, but he's trying to avoid being put to the test, which is a different kind of heroism than we might perhaps see in other texts. He's not openly opposing in a way that perhaps would be expected of a traditionally heroic character. So he's once more dragged before these powers and asked to submit. Cromwell says, "Yet do you not know that even now, if you could bring yourself to agree with the universities, the bishops, and the parliament of this realm, there is no honor which the king would be likely to deny you." So there's this sense that how can you not give in to all of these powers? But he will not. And the king himself is invoked, saying that the king himself may testify against More on one of these charges. The charges that More himself wrote a book in defense of the Seven Sacraments, a Catholic book attacking Protestantism that the king wrote, and that they're accusing More himself of writing in the king's name. But More says this: "Only two people know the truth of the matter, myself and the king, and whatever he may have said to you, he will not give evidence to support this accusation." Cromwell asks why not. "Because evidence is given on oath, and he will not perjure himself. If you don't know that, you don't yet know him." So there's a sense that not only is More a character of conscience in the play, but so is the king, but in a very different way. And Cromwell says this just slightly later on. He says, that the king's a man of conscience, and he wants either Sir Thomas More to bless his marriage or Sir Thomas More destroyed. And Richard Rich thinks that these seem to be very odd alternatives. Cromwell says, do they? Do they seem so? That's because you're not a man of conscience. If the king destroys a man, that's proof to the king that it must have been a bad man. The kind of man a man of conscience ought to destroy. And of course, a bad man's blessing's not worth having. So either will do. Oh, there's no going back, Rich. I find we've made ourselves the keepers of his conscience, and it's ravenous. There's a sense of the king, like his appetite, has a ravenous conscience which must consume everything. So for the king, his conscience is whatever he feels to be right, but everyone must agree with it or be destroyed. We see More grappling with this conception of himself amongst this increasing persecution. He indeed even tries to cut off his friendship with the Duke of Norfolk so that Norfolk will be safe and not guilty by association with him. He foments a quarrel, an artificial quarrel with him about dog breeding, which is the favorite pastime of the nobility, specifically water spaniels, and says, "And what would you do with a water spaniel that was afraid of water? You'd hang it. Well, as a spaniel is to water, so is a man to his own self. I will not give in, because I oppose it. I do. Not my pride, not my spleen, nor any other of my appetites, but I do. I. Is there no single sinew in the midst of this that serves no appetite of Norfolk's, but is just Norfolk? There is. Give that some exercise, my lord, because as you stand, you'll go before your Maker in very ill condition." Right? So there's a sense, again, you remember what playwright Bolt says in his preface, that he conceives of More as the hero of the self, the hero of selfhood, right? It's the I, the self, that is the primary point here. It is that which cannot give in. And you'll notice that he distinguishes that from one's appetites. In other words, in juxtaposition for the king seems to confuse the I with the appetite, his desire for Anne Boleyn, his desire even for a child, with his self. Whereas for More, he has the desire, of course, to not die and not be imprisoned. But above that is the greater sense of self, which he possesses. And he very eloquently extrapolates on his own position about trying actually to avoid martyrdom. He's talking to his son-in-law, Will, and his daughter, Meg. He says, "Now listen, Will, and Meg, you listen too. You know I know you well. God made the angels to show him splendor, as he made animals for innocence and plants for their simplicity. But man he made to serve him wittily, in the tangle of his mind. And if he suffers us to fall to such a case that there is no escaping, then we may stand to our tackle as best we can. And yes, then we may clamor like champions, if we have the spittle for it. And no doubt it delights God to see splendor where he only looked for complexity. But it's God's part, not our own, to bring ourselves to that extremity. Our natural business lies in escaping. So let's get home and study this bill." So he's trying to ascertain whether or not this new bill, this act of supremacy, which all, at least important personages of the realm must sign, agreeing to the marriage, agreeing to the king as head of the church, He wants to be able to sign it if he can in good conscience. He does not deliberately want to oppose it so that he ends up being executed. He's trying to escape. Again, a different kind of heroism than we might expect. And so he's dragged before the authorities, and he's asked again and again why he will not swear to the act. And all he says is, I will not take the oath, and I will not tell you why I will not take the oath. He stands on his silence. And the Duke of Norfolk, again, still acting as something of a friend, is trying to convince him to come along with him. He says, Thomas, look at those names, the names on the bill. You know those men. Can't you do what I did and come with us for fellowship? Sign the bill like everyone else has. And Moore responds, and when we stand before God, and you are sent to paradise for doing according to your conscience, and I am damned for not doing according to mine, will you come with me for fellowship? So, in Moore's sense of the world, while he does not necessarily condemn others for following their own conscience, even when it is in conflict with his, he nevertheless will not give in to his just to follow along with others. He's the exact opposite of that mass of people that the king says follows anything that moves. And so the authorities are in a bit of a bind. How can they overcome this person of Moore who refuses to yield? Well, they offer money to those who will inform on him. And while the Bishop of Canterbury, Cranmer, tells them that it's not to tempt you into perjury, nevertheless, we get the sense that they're willing to have someone perjure themselves to overcome him. And what about torture? We see Cromwell grappling with this. He says he must submit. That's Moore. The alternatives are bad. While Moore's alive, the king's conscience breaks into fresh, stinking flowers every time he gets from bed. And if I bring about Moore's death, I plant my own, I think. There's no other good solution. He must submit. And so he looks at the torture rack, but then realizes that no, the king will not permit it. We have to find some gentler way. So the king's conscience will not permit him to torture. But there is going to be a kind of emotional torture in the end that will be inflicted on Moore. He's been in prison for around a year, unable to see his family, his wife, his daughter, his son-in-law. And they are finally allowed to see him. But they have only been allowed to see him because they have sworn to try, to the best of their ability, to convince Moore to swear to the oath. And they reproach him, particularly his daughter Meg, for tempting this heroicism. She says to him, in any state that was half good, you would be raised up high, not here, for what you've done already. It's not your fault the state's 3/4 bad. Then, if you elect to suffer for it, you elect yourself a hero. And it's interesting, she's really saying it in such a way to indicate that this is a pejorative thing, to elect yourself a hero. But this is how Moore responds. And it's perhaps the best encapsulation of the sense of heroism in the play. That's very neat. But look now. If we lived in a state where virtue was profitable, common sense would make us good, and greed would make us saintly. And we'd live like animals or angels in the happy land that needs no heroes. But since, in fact, we see that avarice, anger, envy, pride, sloth, lust, and stupidity commonly profit far beyond humility, chastity, fortitude, justice, and thought, and have to choose to be human at all, why then perhaps we must stand fast a little, even at the risk of being heroes. Moore may not want to be a hero, but he's willing to risk being one, to stand fast when he needs to. And they continue to work upon him. He cries out that the king is more merciful than you. He doesn't use the rack. And he finally is ready to break down as he's worried that his wife will hate him for what he's done, for choosing to stand and die when he could live. But ultimately realizes, as she says, that he's the best man she ever knew. His family is cruelly forced away by the jailer, once again played by the common man, who tries to defend his action of tearing a wife and daughter away from their father. He says, you understand my position, sir. There's nothing I can do. I'm a plain, simple man, and just want to keep out of trouble. Moore cries out, these plain, simple men. Remember, the common man represents the mass of humanity. And the common man, indeed, is finally forced to put on the hat of the foreman of the jury. Cromwell says, or asks, does the cap fit? And the common man admits that it does. So in other words, the common man will be those who are judging More at the end of this play. And so we come to the conclusion, the climax, the final trial of Thomas More. Cromwell is arguing that his silence, his refusal to say why he will not sign the act, betokens opposition to the state. But More, the consummate lawyer, explains to him the legal maxim of qui tacet consentere videtur, which is Latin for he who is silent seems to consent. If, therefore, More says, you wish to construe what my silence betokens, you must construe that I consented, not that I denied. This is an important point. Legally, under the law, More should be acquitted. Because legally, if a person refuses to say anything regarding, say in this case, an act, the assumption is their consent, not their opposition. But he is nevertheless still accused of opposing the state maliciously. More says that he's misusing conscience, just like a criminal would misuse the name of God. But More is saying that this is out of respect for his own soul. And Cromwell says, you mean your own self. And More says his conception of the soul here, when he responds, a man's soul is his self. Cromwell believes that this is miserable, and that he ought to submit to the state. But More says, is it my place to say good to the state's sickness? Can I help my king by giving him lies when he asks for truth? Will you help England by populating her with liars? More refuses to lie. He does not see that as true service. I said that there was this, earlier in the video, that there was this conflict between service to his conscience and service to the state. But he believes he is serving both, that he is serving the state and the king by not saying that what is false is true. This is not Cromwell's position. No, for Cromwell, he must give in. And so he brings in Sir Richard Rich. And having already appointed Richard Rich to the very high position of Attorney General for Wales, Rich purges himself and tells the court that More had explicitly told him why he opposed the act. More responds, you have your desire of me. What you have hunted me for is not my actions, but the thoughts of my heart. It is a long road you have opened. For first men will disclaim their hearts, and presently they will have no hearts. God help the people whose statesmen walk your road. And before Richard Rich leaves, More asks to speak with him. And he looks at the great golden chain around his neck, this medallion. He wants to know what it's for. And this is where Cromwell tells him that Sir Richard is appointed Attorney General for Wales. And More looks in Richard's face. It says with pain and amusement, for Wales. Why, Richard, it profits a man nothing to give his soul for the whole world, but for Wales. A kind of darkly comical and yet tragic statement. A quotation from the Bible, right, where it says, "You cannot. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul?" He's saying that Richard has given over his soul, his conscience, his sense of truth, and his sense of himself, only for Wales. And so, finally, he gives a speech where he explicitly says that he opposes the act, that the king is not only going against Magna Carta, the charter which says he must respect the freedoms of the church, but his own coronation oath. And he's accused of being malicious for expressing this opinion. But More defends himself. He says, not so, Master Secretary. I am the king's true subject, and pray for him and all the realm. I do none harm, I say none harm, I think none harm. And if this be not enough to keep a man alive, in good faith, I long not to live.
I have, since I came into prison, been several times in such a case that I thought to die within the hour, and I thank our Lord I was never sorry for it, but rather sorry when it passed. And therefore my poor body is at the king's pleasure. With God my death might do him some good. So we get this great statement of passive hero, or the hero of passive resistance. He says, I harm no one, and yet if that is not enough, I cannot live, then I do not want to. And so, as the play concludes, he is led to the block to be beheaded. And he tells the headsman, once again played by the common man, to not be afraid of your office. You send me to God. And the Archbishop of Canterbury looks at him enviously, saying, You're very sure of that, Sir Thomas. He responds, He will not refuse one who is so blithe to go to him. And so Sir Thomas More is beheaded. And the final speech is given to the common man, who takes center stage, takes off the mask of the headsman, and once again breaks the fourth wall and addresses the audience directly, saying, I'm breathing. Are you breathing too? It's nice, isn't it? It isn't difficult to keep alive, friends. Just don't make trouble. Or if you must make trouble, make the sort of trouble that's expected. Well, I don't need to tell you that. Good night. If we should bump into one another, recognize me. This is an interesting choice on the part of the playwright Bolt. The actual final words of the historical person, Sir Thomas More, are these. I die the king's good servant, but God's first. And perhaps if he had ended with those lines, as indeed the 1966 feature film does end, with the exception of a voiceover giving the ends of the characters in the story, perhaps if he had ended with these lines, I die the king's good servant, but God's first, it would have emphasized the very nature of More's heroism. The sense that there's a part of himself that he is unwilling to surrender, even to the state. But by ending with the common man, he is really addressing everyone who is watching the play and causing them to perhaps consider what kind of a person they are. What is that part of themselves which they wouldn't surrender? As Moore puts it, being a hero is a risk. And maybe it's not just the risk to oneself. For Moore, it's also the risk of propping oneself up as a hero. He does not want to grandstand, it seems, throughout the play. He wants to avoid the end. He wants to try and save himself. And he's passive throughout. We'll see later in the next video, when we begin looking at Shakespeare's Henry V, what an active hero looks like. One whose virtues and his vices are based in action. For Moore, there's a passivity to him, somewhat similar to, say, what you see in a saint's life, like the life of St. Margaret and the dragon. And yet, there's an activity to the thing in this resistance. There's a sense in which passive resistance is not really passive at all. In fact, it's the prime action of the character.